And I do think we've got into this really terrible pattern of just wanting everyone to do the same when it works. But actually, it might work because of the practitioner. It might work because of the cohort. And I think sharing is important. Let me just make that clear. I think sharing good practice is vital. But the idea that we would all do the same thing is kind of strange. We're all different humans and we're all working with very different humans.
Welcome to Rethinking Education. Education's critical friend.
Autonomy, David. What's that all about?
Yeah, great conversation coming up. There'll be lots of discussion about meanings and all sorts, but autonomy in this context is about people being trusted, getting agency, and being allowed to do the job that most teachers are more than capable of doing.
Yes. Do you feel like you have enough autonomy in your life?
A brilliant question on which I often reflect. I live in a house with a dog I didn't want to get, in a situation I didn't want to be in. So I'm not sure I have any autonomy at all. That's why I work. I go into education to get autonomy, James.
There you go. Work is freedom. I think so.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The long work to freedom.
Yeah, man. I actually feel like I have a decent amount of, I think I might even have too much autonomy in my life. I think that I could do with a bit, like, because I work from home so much, and I do get to have a lot of say over what I do and when and how. But it's a really interesting concept, isn't it? Because it's often sort of bandied around, that word, as though it's just like an unalloyed good. It's just a good thing, right? Like autonomy, we should have lots of it. But this is a very interesting conversation, and a bit that blew my mind was when you said, I think, like, you can autonomously choose the degree of autonomy that you might want, and there are downsides to it, and some people really like, to be in a very tightly controlled environment where everything is very clear, and that they don't have too much sort of freedom for maneuver because they might not know what they're doing properly yet. And so it's a really, really rich sort of conversation. And in this episode, we'll be discussing Sophie Smith-Tong's wonderful book, Teacher Autonomy, Where Has It Gone and Why We Need It Back? And I commend it to you, as do I commend this episode. And so without further ado, let's dive into this fascinating conversation with Sophie Smith-Tong. Sophie Smith-Tong, we got there in the end. Welcome to the Rethinking Education podcast.
Thank you. Oh, this is quite a special moment for me because I've listened to this podcast for a really long time. So to be here is very special.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think back to where I remember seeing you, like we chatted after the first Rethinking Ed conference.
Yeah.
That
would have been when I met you in person, wouldn't it? That would have been the first time when I spoke there. 2023?
23. That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. There
Beginning
you go.
of my journey.
Indeed. And so congratulations on your book, Teacher
Thank
Autonomy,
you.
Where Has It Gone and Why We Need It Back. Nicely done. It's great. It's a great read.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm pleased it's out there. Feels like a lifetime ago that I wrote it, though. It's quite nice to refresh my memory with these interviews.
They have quite a long tail, don't they, these things?
Yeah.
But no, it's really good. David and I were just saying we both hugely enjoyed reading it. We're really looking forward to getting into this conversation. For the benefit of listeners, we've had an interesting off recording chat about the definition of autonomy and what is it that we're really talking about here, and we'll get into all of that. But first, just for anybody who is not yet familiar with you or your work, can you just explain a little bit about who you are and what you do and how this book came to be?
Yeah, so I've been teaching. I'm Sophie Smith-Tong, obviously, but I've been teaching for 16 years, mental health and wellbeing lead for the last 8 years. my journey into kind of well-being came after coming back from maternity leave and all of a sudden waking up to really poor school community mental health, and we were getting really good results, and I just thought, hang on a minute, but everyone's kind of a bit broken. And so I think it was before mental health and well-being leads were roles in schools, and I said to my head, like, I'd like to take this on, and read Adrian Bethune's book Wellbeing in the Primary Classroom. And then it just went on from there. But as I started to delve a bit deeper into well-being, I kind of started thinking a bit more deeply about, the structures that were causing poor well-being. And yeah, came across this idea of basically the lack of trust that we as professionals feel from the system itself, but also sometimes the leaders that we're working with who are under their own pressures. So yeah, I started noting those things down, and then suddenly there was a book.
I'm impressed by that. There is never suddenly a book in my life.
And a few tears, David, a few tears in between.
I mean, even when I edit one and get other people to write the chapters, it still doesn't suddenly appear. So.
I certainly did not.
Absolute kudos. I love that. Well done.
So we will get, let's just see how far we get into this conversation before the question of what autonomy actually is comes up. But let's just start with the introduction of your book, right? So you mentioned there was a teacher tap poll done a couple of years ago where only 18% of teachers said that they strongly agree with the statement, I have a great deal of choice and freedom in deciding how I do my work.
Yeah.
Why do you think that number is so low?
I think it's to do with fear. And, I listened to your last recording with Dee, and, where there is fear, there is usually control. We have high stakes accountability measures that cause a lot of fear in our schools. And when we feel that way, we tend to tighten control because we think there's going to be less risk. And so I think that's just been tightening and tightening and tightening. It's certainly something I've felt over the last 16 years. And even as an experienced teacher, and not that I would know any more than an ECT, obviously I have experience, but ECTs come with their own strengths. But there are many situations where perhaps we're not trusted.
Yeah. I wonder if we should maybe just spend a few minutes just sort of fleshing this out, because you said that that's been your experience, that the amount of autonomy has decreased or the amount of control has increased. And I think that there's a general agreement. Would you agree that they're basically, what is the opposite of autonomy in schools? It's control. And it feels like there's been more and more control exerted over the last 16 years. And maybe going back even further, we mentioned before we started recording, didn't we, that that whole was it the speech about the secret garden of education, right? The speech. David, help me out. Who was the Prime Minister? Was it Wilson? Callaghan.
Yeah.
James Callaghan. Is it James?
This is why you need. This is why you need the elderly. This is why you need the elderly. Because sometimes we can remember stuff. Sometimes we know it and we've forgotten it. But it's always handy. It's good. I was there.
To be fair, I'm playing my age card there because it was when I was about a toddler that speech happened. So he gave a speech where he said that education is like this walled off garden and we don't know what's going on in there and we need to have more control. Essentially, that was when politicians started rolling their sleeves up, and it's what led to ultimately to the creation of like Ofsted and the national curriculum and all of these ideas that still dominate our lives, 30 or so years later.
Yeah.
And so there was clearly like an increase of control there. And there was lots of autonomy first of all, and then more control. But it does feel to me like there has been more and more control. And I don't know whether that's just a perception or is it really real? What's your sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that education has always been controlled somewhat. I don't think it's ever been I don't know if you've seen school circles about the democratic schools in the Netherlands, but it's never been that, like, where there's this sense of playfulness in our learning and curiosity, and that teachers are able to move things around. And, I don't think our education system has ever looked like that. But I certainly think that it has become more ludicrous. The things that were shared with me, the things that I've experienced, it's become, yeah, more laughable, I think, in a way,
Yeah. All
in the
right.
most serious of ways.
Let's get into some examples, because I've got some some examples of that I could draw on.
Go
But
on,
like,
James. What have you got?
oh well, so the first one that sprang to mind, when I was the last time I was teaching in a mainstream secondary school, they had this rule that you had to have your blazer on at all times, which was weird to start with. And then there was like a heat wave. It was absolutely boiling. It was like 30 degrees heat, and everyone was complaining, and they held the line. It was a bit like one of those, like, you get like a little, like a news cycle, and like at some point somebody's got to come out and do a press conference, and they held the line for a few days, and everyone was like, honestly, can you please just, like, you need to send some sort of communication about this, like these little year sevens are like sweltering. And eventually they issued this thing, and they literally printed this out and they put it up around the school, and it said, like, during transitions between lessons, you're allowed to not wear a blazer, but it must be draped over your forearm. And it
It
was
sounds like my daughter's ballet exam, when she has to go in with her skirt draped over her arm as part of tradition. Wow, that's quite something. I've not heard that one before.
Yeah, it was quite a unique one, and it's definitely, fairly atypical. But there are lots of similar examples of, like, just like lots of increasing, tightening of like essentially reducing variation. Like, my world is implementation science, and there's this word fidelity that people
Hmm.
use all the time, as in like hi-fi, high fidelity, which means copying accuracy. And it's like, can we just make everything almost like with machine-like precision? Can we just make all of these people do exactly the same thing all of the time? That seems to be this sort of underlying assumption that's often the case, getting everybody to sing from the same hymn sheet and so on. And it's sort of, you can see how it can come from a good place, because the variation between what we consider to be, good teaching and less good teaching is huge. And if we could reduce that variation, then it would improve outcomes for kids. So you can sort of see, like, the road to hell is often paved with good intentions, isn't it? But
Yeah.
and yeah, lots of other examples of, like, schools not being able to decide how they organize their tables. They've heard of, some academy trusts that describe their head teachers as middle managers. They don't really have any say over what happens in their school. I could talk more, but there are many such examples, and I'm sure that you've got some yourself, Sophie.
Yeah, I mean, the talk of fidelity, we're used to hearing fidelity to a scheme. I had one teacher who contacted me to say that they'd had feedback after a phonics lesson. The strength was the way that teacher held their cards well. But the next step was that they needed to remove what the little things that they'd added to make it more personalized for their cohort. So you think that's asking them to, like, praising their fidelity, the way they move phonics cards, which I think is patronizing in itself.
Yeah.
And then kind of saying, well, you need to get better by being more, having fidelity to the scheme. That's something that's really common. And this idea of variation, I think, is really scary in the climate that we're in, because when you have variety, you take risk. I guess it's more nuanced. But I think with that comes the strength of connection, real genuine connection. So I think that's really important. But in terms of, like, specific examples, they're all going to fall out of my head now, aren't they? So, like, colors on display, choosing how you plan. So I've heard of some teachers having to hand their planning in on one day and it being handed back, being marked the following day. So then they've got to come back with all the changes made before it's been approved. I've heard teachers say that they were told in observations that their lessons were not exactly the same time as their partner teacher. They need to work on that. What were the other ones? The having to have every email approved before sending it out, or any contact with parents have to be approved before conversations happen. Following scripts, pulled up on when they've missed a word out of a script or said something slightly different from what the script suggests. And I do think we have a tendency, just thinking back to kind of this sense of variety, we have a tendency in education to want to, when we discover something good, like you say, that kind of idea of good teaching, we do want to spread it. We want to blanket it across everywhere, because it's like we found this bit of gold that we think brilliant. And I was actually speaking to Tina Farr from St Ebbe's about her seating and the variety in the seating. And she told me how the year 5 teacher had come to her and said, look, I really want to trial different kinds of seating in my classroom. And me being in education and doing what we do best, I immediately said, oh, brilliant. So have you got it in all classes now? And she kind of laughed and said, well, no, because that's not going to work for all teachers or all children. And I do think we've got into this really terrible pattern of just wanting everyone to do the same when it works. But actually, it might work because of the practitioner. It might work because of the cohort. And I think sharing is important. Let me just make that clear. I think sharing good practice is vital. But the idea that we would all do the same thing is kind of strange. We're all different humans and we're all working with very different humans. So, yeah.
But this is one of the really fascinating things about the book, because the book is built around exemplification. And you've just quoted St Abbs and Tina Farr, and that's one of the people that features in the book and also has featured on the programme.
Yeah.
And you've been able to populate the book with lots of examples of what you would be describing as exceptional approaches and exceptional behaviours and instances where schools are based on trust, etc. So there's something in there, isn't there, about the autonomy we have and the autonomy we take. So there's something interesting in there about what's that about? Why is there autonomy in St Abbs? Why is there autonomy in Barrowford? Why is there autonomy in all sorts of other settings, but not in others?
I think once you, I do think, again, it's based on a sense of fear. And I think a lot about what we carry as educators for ourselves in terms of our own past experiences, our own traumas, our own interactions, and how that feeds into our approaches in teaching, in leadership, because they undoubtedly will. And I think there's something to be said there for being able to remove ego and to not take things personally, and to allow others to become part of the world that you have here. Like, I was listening to Hayley Peacock, who is the founder of Atelier 21, the other day, and we had a meeting, and she was talking to me about how when she went to Reggio Emilia, she came back, actually it was a podcast episode, she went to Reggio Emilia and she completely came back shifted, different person, but she already had a nursery, and she went in and she just went straight in there and threw a load of plastic resources in the bin and told all of her team that we're just changing everything, like this is it now. But no, obviously she feels that sense of passion because she's experienced that thing. But we can't get that across to other people unless we kind of take our time with it, unless we nurture other people's passions, we listen to other people and we take their side on board as well. It can't just be about us. And so I think sometimes with some leaders, there can be this sense of ego that actually, no, this is how I want to do it. This is what I've wanted to do all my life. I'm here now. This is what we're doing. So I think there is an element of that. But also, that it's really scary when you're being inspected to verbalize what that means and what it looks like, because I think when you're working with autonomy, it can be a little bit less tangible. Like, you can't see it and hold it in the same way you can data, or you can books full of worksheets, or consistency. Like, for example, if you walk into a classroom in every school and they've got the same colors, I think subconsciously it feels more controlled and more ordered and more thought out. So immediately that person who's only staying there for an hour will feel like there's a sense of control in here. This is organized. This must be good. Whereas you walk into a different classrooms and they're completely different, or, it's a little bit more noisy because we're allowing for that child autonomy. It's not immediately noticeable that organization, that setting has thought things through. It might seem like they haven't, and they haven't got time to delve deeper into that. So I can see why I don't think it's because of bad practice or people who have no idea what they're doing. I think it comes from a very natural, explainable fear and insecurity, I guess, sometimes.
Yeah. I guess the thing I really liked was that everything would be in your book, was the idea everything would be easier if we changed the system. If we had an inspection system rather than an enforcement system. But at the same time, what the book says is this is not a lost cause. You don't need to wait till the system changes. You
No.
can change things where you are. And I think that's a really powerful and encouraging message people need to hear. And I love that you tell these stories, because the point of telling stories is to get the echo that other people will read that and say, worth a try. And
Yeah.
that's a really powerful combination, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really important to me, because it's the only reason that I'm still in it, I think, because it can be really hard to stay in a system that can become extremely frustrating. And I'm not talking about specifically the setting I'm working in, it is the larger system. But what I think it's important we think about the day to day, because ultimately, we as educators, we do tend to wait for our lives to start in the half term, in the holidays, or things are going to get better in 5 years or whatever. And actually, no, like, I'm living my life now. These children are living their lives now. We need to find a way to work with what we've got. And meanwhile, people can be working on another level for systemic change. I think it's really important that we have hope. I wanted the book to be hopeful. I think it can work, and I wanted people to be able to implement these things, embed these things straight away to make those instant changes. I think we've got enough on to be looking at systemic change as well as running a classroom.
Let's rethink education.
Hello everybody, I will keep this short and sweet, so no need to reach for that skip button. We love making this podcast, and with over 600,000 episodes downloaded to date, it seems like people out there are enjoying it too. In fact, we even hear from people from time to time. It is a labour of love, though, with the emphasis on both the love and the labour. Producing each episode involves reading books, carrying out the interviews, obviously editing them, paying for the increasingly bewildering array of tools that keep a show like this running. Most people don't realize, but podcasts like this rely on support from people like yourselves. Right now, we have 27 patrons who help us to keep this show going. If just 1% of our listeners joined them at patreon.com/repod, we could sustainably create even more of these amazing conversations, which I think are increasingly urgent. There are various tiers to choose from, with different benefits attached to each tier, starting from as little as the price of a cup of coffee or herbal tea per month. Or if you prefer to make a one-off donation, you can do so at buymeacoffee.com/repod. Either way, if you just want to carry on listening, please feel free to do so. And thank you very much for being part of this community. Now let's get back to today's episode. So we've talked a bit about like autonomy versus control. I just want to touch briefly on like what are the consequences of this, and it's sort of fairly implicit, but I just want to sort of draw these out. What are the consequences of this, like this drift that we've seen? And I think that I'm happy to pin my colors to that mast. I do feel like in the last, what is it, 20 years since I trained as a teacher, there has been a tightening of control and more of this sort of micromanagement that we've been describing. It's not in every school, but I definitely am seeing more of it in my practice, in schools that I've worked with and for, and also online and in the things that people are writing about and that are gaining traction. People seem to like it. Some people really seem to like it, and they very proudly talk about the extent to which everything is like super screwed down. And so let's talk about this. And there could be positive, no doubt there are positive consequences as well as what we might frame as negative consequences. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, my immediate thought was ECTs. I spoke to a lot of ECTs when I was writing the book, and their immediate response to the idea of autonomy was like, "Oh no, I don't want that." And we spoke about it, and they also didn't feel like they were entitled to it, which I thought was really interesting. Like you have to earn it over time, and I know that there is some research to suggest that people in more senior kind of roles are experiencing autonomy more. But I do think, for ECTs especially, they haven't experienced what that feels like. And I think there is kind of a de-skilling going on because, new teachers are teaching mainly from schemes. So, I had the joy of having to figure stuff out creatively and having put my imprint on it and work with other people to create something. And that's really rewarding when you deliver it and it works. It's also really disappointing when it doesn't, but you learn from it. So I think we get used to being spoon-fed or having those scripts and the prescription, and it's easier because it doesn't take as much time. But is the reward the same? Probably not.
It's an interesting combination, isn't it? Because the 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 kind of culture that you're describing there is absolutely about fear. You know, I'm a new teacher. There's one of me. There's 30 of them. This is a scary situation. What if it goes wrong? And that fear is what, if you like, the system preys on in terms of control. So, we have inspection as enforcement rather than a validation or self-evaluation or whatever. And it's just interesting, isn't it? Because teaching's quite an insecure activity. And often people do, as you suggest, James, they seek that comfort blanket of conformity because then if something goes wrong, it's not your fault.
Yeah, I always think that with my phonics scheme. It's the one part of teaching that I kind of tend to disconnect from because I have to teach from a script. That actually, when the results don't come back and they're not delivering, I'm just like, what can I do? Like, this is nothing to do with my teaching and
Right.
everything to do with the scheme. I can't, and I guess for some people that can be a bit of a relief. When in a situation where we are held accountable, being able to relieve some of that can be nice.
Yeah. It's definitely a mixed picture, isn't it? Like I recently spoke with some teachers in the Netherlands. They got in touch about some work I've been doing around behavior, and they were talking about how they work in what it was a gymnasium, and they talk about it as a very high autonomy environment, high autonomy for the students and for teachers. And they were talking about, I think that they'd picked up on, there's a stat that I think that we'd used, the government used it recently, something like 7 minutes out of every 30 are lost to low-level disruption, is the estimation. And they were sort of saying, we think that would, like, we would happily settle for that. They were like, we think that way more of our time, lesson time, is being lost to kids just talking off task, and it's all very sort of amicable. And they described the teachers saying that they can sort of see their younger selves in these students. They sort of identified with them. They saw them almost as equals, and they didn't really want to challenge them. But these teachers clearly talked about this sense of frustration that they had, that they didn't really feel able, when everybody's autonomy is turned up to the max, that it's hard to sort of to get things done. And it's, it can be sort of in a weirdly way can become kind of toxic, albeit, for positive intended reasons.
Yeah, I think, if we think about the early years as vital here, in that if we have autonomy from the beginning, we would have the space and time to spend on real connection, real belonging, real self-esteem, real personal, social, emotional learning. And they would be ready for and used to that kind of education. It's like, when a teacher gets the paintbrushes out and they hate doing art because the children don't know how to use any of it and it's chaos in the classroom. But if you're doing art regularly, we know how it works. It's not a special one-off occasion where the children feel like they've got to jump on it and make the most of it because they know it's coming again next week. I think it's a skill in itself, isn't it? And I think, this year with my reception class, I have, made changes so that my children have more autonomy. And I am really reaping, and they are reaping the benefits right now in this, as the summer term hits. I have seen, like, I've had to wait to see. And I think that's something we're not very good at in education, especially when we're being held accountable. We need results now. We need the data now. We need to see something change now. But, this stuff, it feeds in more long term. And you can see, I'm in a class with 34-year-olds and it's manageable and they're choosing and we're in a situation where we're all making decisions together. And if you can do that with a load of 4-year-olds, I think it can be done anywhere. I think, like, what David was talking about, this idea of this collective, that's, that direction, having direction is really important to feel safe and to be able to take risks and be vulnerable and try stuff out.
Yeah.
I think traditionally it's the other way around. In that, my experience of early years is that, people in Scotland certainly have a sense of greater freedom in early years. They have a different starter document that's realizing the ambition rather than the rear view mirror stuff that you have in England. And where the knot really tightens is once the young people come into certificate courses, particularly. So, classically, we would see more autonomy in the first 2 years of secondary school, and that would gradually diminish as kids moved closer and closer to certificate exams. And, your mention of Reggio Emilia was interesting earlier because that was our model when I was Director of Children's Services in Stirling. Everybody did Reggio Emilia. That was what we believed in. We sent people out to Italy. We ate spaghetti. We made tomato sauce constantly. We drank Chianti. We became members of the Communist Party just in sympathy with Reggio Emilia. It was just interesting. We were comfortable with that, but that clearly wasn't how people were teaching the Scottish equivalent of A level. So there are some interesting elements around that where the goals are less defined, the possibility of autonomy should be much stronger, I think.
I mean, I understand what you're saying. So with the early years, obviously we have the prime areas, which are personal, social, physical development and communication and language. So we're already kind of, in my view, at a better point because we are identifying those as the most important things, and that becomes more difficult. I think the transition to year one now, unfortunately, it's kind of trickled even further down. The transition to year one for children is where it all kind of goes wrong because suddenly they're sat at tables doing what I call child admin. It's just, and that's where the behavior creeps in. And a teacher feels they can't choose to not do that. That's where that lack of autonomy impacts both educator and child. So I think it does, that control will undoubtedly get worse as they get older, I guess.
Mm. All right, so let's get into this definition question. And in some sense, it's easier to define what the opposite of autonomy is, right? So that we talked about the opposite of autonomy. It's like it's micromanagement. It could take the form of coercion and control. It's like a lack of empowerment, people not having the ability to make even the smallest decisions, like you've been talking about, leading to a need for constant approval from external sources. Like you were talking about, a lack of sense of responsibility. If this doesn't work, it wasn't my fault because I just took it off the shelf, right? And this sort of like high authority, low trust environment. And more widely, there's been lots of research on this in the workplace, in the world of work beyond schools, and it's pretty well established. I think it's a fairly robust finding that people really value the importance of autonomy in the workplace, even more so than how much they get paid. There's a robust findings that it's linked with that work-related autonomy is associated with better mental health, with better outcomes as well. Because like when people have a small amount of say over what they do and when and how, they sort of have the ability to take pride more in their work and to take ownership of what they're doing, and to feel like the opposite of what we just talked about, that I did this thing and it was me that did that, and wasn't that brilliant? And that's so it's like a really deep rooted thing in people. And you see it in very young children, right? That sort of no, me do it, that sort of just like determination to just leave me alone and like just let me figure this out for myself. It goes very deep. And so this stuff is really important, but as we've seen, it's kind of a bit double-edged. And so I think that it might be good to try and get some clarity on this. So you must have thought a lot about this. There's lots of discussion about this word. What's your take on it, Sophie? Do you have a sort of a working definition that you were using in writing this book?
Yeah, I mean, it's, for me, I kind of a one sentence definition would be too hard, but I went on a journey with it because obviously when I first started writing the book, I didn't know what I was going to call it. I think I wanted to call it eventually educator autonomy because I didn't think it necessarily was just about teachers, but yeah, and then obviously looking up autonomy and what it means, and it changed. My perception of it changed because I do think it's not either all autonomy or no autonomy. There is so much in between. And in my head, the self-governance definition is strong. I think like it's about self-governance, but we cannot have autonomy on our own without support, without professional learning opportunity. I feel like it's not about shoving a teacher in the classroom and saying, do what you want, when you want, however you want, and get on with it. And because some teachers, like you say, would just run with it and like, do all sorts. And then you've got some teachers who would just stand and cry. Like, I don't know what to do. Like, I haven't had any support. So there's varying levels of autonomy and varying levels of support that will need to be in place to utilize autonomy. And I think, ultimately for me, it's being able to make decisions based on my professional knowledge and those of the people around me as well, like taking into consideration. Because I think when you're working towards a collective goal and you're all part of that journey, you begin to respect each other's differences. And you begin to be able to, is it called sociocracy? So like, that idea that you kind of compromise on the final result because you've spoken about your concerns and other people have given you a reason to think differently about that. And you might not necessarily agree with the final decision, but you've been part of the journey to get there. So I think that's what happens when you have that collective goal, is that you respect each other equally enough to go, yeah, no, I see where you're coming from. Don't necessarily agree, but like I've been part of it, and I've had my voice heard. So yeah, I've gone on, James. Sorry, I didn't do it in one sentence, and I did it in about 100 sentences. That shows how difficult it is.
I mean, I do think that there's a real tension around the title and the book. For me, it's a book
Shall I
about
ask the
trust.
publishers to change it, David?
Well, they could change it in my copy.
And then can we say the new title and then written by David Cameron underneath?
Well,
There
that
we
would.
go. I have a blank post-it note waiting for your instruction, David.
Yeah. I mean, essentially, I think it's a book about the importance of trust and the importance of agency. And it was a book. One of the things I loved about it was that I have a slide I use all the time, which is the real answer to teacher well-being is job satisfaction. And fundamentally, that's an awful lot of what's at the heart of the book, that
Yeah,
people need to be able to see their success. They need to be able to be who they are, to use the resources they have. And you make the case for that, I think, incredibly well. And I don't actually think it matters that, you know, we're slightly at odds about the language over it. I was saying in an email to you that when I was a school leader, the people that wanted autonomy were arrogant, individualistic, right-wing trads who were essentially Luddites, and were missing the blackboard and couldn't really function unless chalk had been ingrained in their fingertips for at least half of the day. So, I was battling with people who were telling me they wanted to exercise their autonomy and be clones of some imagined tradition that only exists in Nick Gibbs' head. And so there's an interesting dichotomy there. And I think you used a phrase offline, which was aligned autonomy. That
yes,
that what we need is a system where we agree on purpose and values because they're absolutely central. And once we agree on that, people have the capacity to improvise, to express themselves, and to do that within a climate of trust.
yeah,
I, and autonomy doesn't, for me, as a word, doesn't quite get it. Agency doesn't quite get it either. I think
yeah.
the important thing is that what the book's about is profoundly helpful. I think the vision that you have of, if you like, collaborative autonomy, if there is such a thing, I think is a
It's
one.
a new word that we'll take ownership of.
Indeed. And I think the other thing which I always believed in is that people have autonomy to go and work somewhere where they're happy. I've had schools where they would proudly tell me that people don't stay there if they don't buy into the values because they're so embedded in the culture. And I think that's right and proper. I think there should be places people can go and work where they're compatible with the system. But we
Yeah,
need to be working together. We need to have a culture. And the book absolutely expresses that, Sophie. So a linguistic argument no way outweighs the argument around the essential messages that you're delivering.
yeah. Thank you, David. Yeah, I think obviously the message of the book, yeah, perhaps isn't fully in the title. I think it's hard, isn't it, to put into two words, I guess, what it is.
Mm.
But
Yeah,
yeah, I go on, James.
I was just gonna say I'm okay with this. I'm okay with this title. I think it's like we've said, it's a complicated idea, but that's you can't get a complicated. You don't need a paragraph as a book title, or it would never sell. Like there are linked ideas here, right? He talks about aligned autonomy or collaborative. Michael Fullan talks about connected autonomy. And there's a chapter in my book called "Tight but Loose Implementation," and that seems to me to be a good way of sort of resolving this tension that you've got. You were just talking, David, about being tight around purpose and values, but loose around having a capacity to sort of improvise and what have you. And there are essentially two dangers whenever you go down any route. If you sort of say, right, we're going to have a homework policy, and it's like, right, every single kid is going to have exactly the same homework, and they've all got to do it in exactly the same way. That's
Yeah,
two too tight. Like different kids
Yeah.
might not benefit from that, and maybe it would be good to have a bit of flexibility. But if it's totally loose and it's just like just do whatever for homework or don't do any homework at all. I know you're not a fan of homework, Sophie, but maybe
Yeah, I saw that in the
we'll
questions.
sidebar that one for now. But obviously, so there's some sort of you can walk the line between these two points of tension, and I think that like we mentioned this offline as well, but I think that degrees of autonomy is a good way of sort of resolving this tension. I don't think that you're saying that teachers should have complete self-rule,
No.
of course. But like you can have a greater or lesser amount of self-rule, and it feels like there has been maybe the screws have become a little too tight recently, and people are like not able to even someone was telling me a while ago that they were told by their instructional coach that in the middle of a lesson that their clock shouldn't be on the front wall because it was cognitive overload for the children, because they'll be thinking about what time it is and not like what's on what the task is or whatever. And you can just get to ludicrous degrees of micromanagement. And clearly, so it's about walking the line. But I think that control, like it is the autonomy dial that we're dealing with here, like to greater or lesser amounts of self-governance. And so I think I'm okay with the title.
Yeah, and I guess people are comfortable with different levels as well. There's something else to think about, which I had, but I guess that comes with support, different levels of support as well, which, I did write about. There's not kind of it's not one or the other, is it? There's so much in between.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I realized when I started teaching particularly is that if you're totally working against the grain of the school and the system, you're an outlier. And as an outlier, all you do is cause confusion and disruption for kids because they can't adjust. I was a secondary teacher, and they can't adjust coming into your room for a period and finding this nirvana of anarchistic chaos and creativity, and then go next door and do maths with somebody that was still using corporal punishment. They just couldn't cope with that.
Yeah.
So I think the important difference we make is that you have the autonomy not to be an outlier. You have the autonomy to make judgments about where you'll compromise your natural instincts to strengthen the culture of the school. And if you don't like the culture of the school, then I think you need to go somewhere else.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that to feel safe in an environment, you need some things to be consistent, and those things usually are the foundational elements, like, excuse me, your values and ethos. And I think it happens organically that if people don't quite agree with what the collective is going for, that they will usually find somewhere else. You are undoubtedly going to find a direction as a team, and that direction isn't for everybody. And I don't think anyone is on making those people feel like that on purpose, but I think it naturally feels like that. When you found your place. The consistent elements can be decided as well by the team. Those things we can all be part of that decision making in some form. And that's also really important because then, like you say, that sense of pride, the team that I work with, we all feel so proud of the part that we've played in the really clear direction of the children's centre. And we all feel very valued there. And that means that we kind of have we're staffed there for a really long time, that we're not closed down to reflection and change, and adapting things to suit new year groups. And so I think it really does make for good well-being, like you said, James.
Which is the perfect segue. Thank you for that. So chapter 1, we've made it through the introduction. Chapter 1 is autonomy and teacher well-being.
Yes.
And you're quite critical about this. So the opening, I'll just share for listeners. This chapter opens along with the words mindfulness, self-care, and boundaries. Well-being has become an incredibly irritating word in the education world. When I deliver staff training on well-being, you can see the exasperation and resentment in the teacher's eyes. So some strong words there. Talk to us a bit about that. What's going on there?
Well, when I launched Mindfulness for Learning, which is my wellbeing centre for educators and families, I took 18 months out of the classroom to launch it. And I designed and delivered wellbeing training for staff and children. Um, but I think you quickly lose touch. It was only 18 months, but education changes all the time. And also I think you just forget what it's like to be in the classroom. And I think the feeling that I had delivering it was that it just wasn't cutting it. And I was trying to think why, like what is it that's not feeling aligned? And it was because it's just not good enough. Like going in and telling staff to eat well, to notice when they're stressed, notice it in their body, do yoga, mindfulness, all of which, by the way, I do all of those things. I love mindfulness, I love yoga, I exercise, I eat well. But going in and talking about that stuff just feels like a sticking plaster because it doesn't work alongside the system that we have. It's the levels of stress and workload and frustration you feel when you don't have a say over your working life is persistent, and it's persistent high stress levels. So
Mm.
we can do a bit of yoga and get rid of a bit of that stress, but underneath it all it's still there, it's underlying. And so it just felt, I'm a mental health and wellbeing lead, so I'm really aware of how those things can be helpful, like booking in a yoga class for your staff. It's appreciated, but it isn't wellbeing. Wellbeing is about making change to better the lives of their working lives, the staff's working lives.
I'm absolutely standing and applauding, in my head at least, um, because that's exactly my argument is that almost all the well-being activity is the treatment of symptoms and the ignoring of the disease.
Mm.
So what we do is we help people to deal with the symptoms, which is useful.
Yeah.
As you say, we do a bit of yoga, we reduce a bit of stress, and that gives you a bit more capacity to face up to what's really wrong with you. But, I feel that the culture we've got around well-being just now is like leeches.
Mm.
You stick them on and pretend they're a cure. They're not. They're a distraction at best because unless we address the things that are making people stress, which are
Yeah.
workload, lack of control, the fear that we've talked about earlier, and the tension that all of that creates, then people will not be well.
Yeah, yeah.
So well done.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, yeah, it's just one of those things I think that as a teacher, again, having wellbeing training, that it really it makes me angry, and it's not directed at the person delivering the training, but yeah, I think there's not an educator that I've spoken to who doesn't feel that way
Yeah.
about wellbeing.
Yeah, if another tosser tells me about breathing, honestly, I'm
Take
gonna
a breath.
take a breath and then punch them. I think that's the right sequence. I think that's the right.
I feel seen and shamed all at once.
Yeah, yeah. I feel seen and shamed that now I'm going to strike you.
Oh, brilliant.
And so can we just connect? Can we just join the dots here? How is autonomy connecting to well-being, Sophie, in your eyes?
How is autonomy connecting to well-being? It's a motivator. Autonomy is a motivator, and if you feel motivated to go to work, you're enthusiastic. Like, I just think of my physical state when I'm being told to do something that I know is ineffective, damaging, and I'm told to do it on a daily basis, and there's no movement, there's no flexibility, like what that does to me physically, the tension, the chest, like my heart rate, and imagine that every day, like what that does for your physical well-being, and then your mental well-being when you're having there's no movement in anything, and you're having to do things that are meaningless. It's frustrating on every level, and I think that's the workload is so huge as a teacher, but piling that on top, that managing of the ineffective practice and demands is, I think, worse than any kind of data spreadsheet that I've had to do.
Can I put something to you that I talk about all the time, despite the fact there's absolutely no research base at all. It's just something I made up. But I talk about the difference between good tired and bad tired. And good tired is when you've worked really hard, but you've been doing what you believe in and you feel you've had a good outcome and you're absolutely tired, but you fall asleep, you sleep well and recover. And the alternative is bad tired,
Yeah.
which is where you're exhausted, not because of the activity, but also because of the frustration. And that's the tiredness that you wake up from in the middle of the night,
Yeah.
like bolt upright like a meerkat,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no recovery through rest. And
Yeah.
I think that's the difference, that what we're calling, for the purposes of this conversation, autonomy makes,
Yeah.
that it allows you to be good tired. It allows you the satisfaction. It allows you that sense of, being consistent to your own values, your own intentions and outcomes. And that may well make you tired, but it's that lovely tiredness. You just slip into sleep and you wake up,
Yeah. Yeah,
the
it's so true, isn't it? That if you're feeling like you're satisfied with what you've done and how you've done it, it doesn't really matter if it, fails because you've
yeah,
taken that risk and you've done it from your heart and in a way that you felt it would work. And so there's that sense of ownership, that reward, and yeah, it balances it out, doesn't it?
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So the next two chapters, there's one on teaching and learning and one on accountability. And there's a lot in here that we haven't really got time to do justice to. But I have one question here. I remember when the curriculum and assessment review came out, and everyone was quite excited about it. And to be honest, in Oracy, like we were really on tenterhooks because like the Oracy didn't receive a single word in the interim report, and then
Yeah.
it came out, and Oracy was writ large, and it was everything that we had wished for and arguably a bit more. Like they really went for it with Oracy, which is a wonderful thing. And so I was mainly focusing on that. But I remember you sort of live posting as you were reading through the curriculum and assessment review, and you weren't quite so enamored as some other people were. And so my question here is the curriculum and assessment review: evolution versus revolution. Discuss.
Yeah, I was disappointed. I was really hopeful because I think I have to be really mindful because I've worked in education a long time and you can become a cynic. And I'm very aware of that kind of default. So I question every initial response that I have over and over again. I dig deeper, I speak to people, I check myself, and I kind of have conversations with people out of education so I can have that, that idea of am I just layering on this kind of fed up? I'm fed up of it, kind of that layer.
Mm,
Yeah, but I was disappointed and I took some time to read it and write a few responses. But yeah, I just think it's not good enough. And I think it really showed how, what's the word I'm looking for? How lacking we are in some things because actually they I think they put the word drama in there a couple of times and everyone was just so excited. Again, like when you get the paintbrushes out, it felt like that because actually the content wasn't that great. It was just that they were going, yeah, you can do a bit of drama, and we were like, we could do drama, and it just wasn't good enough in my eyes. There was a lot of testing, referencing to testing, assessment was said so many times, I can't remember. I know I wrote an article on it, but it was a while ago now. But yeah, and when I went to the curriculum review, the panel, one of the in-person events, and what was really shocking was the lack of teachers in there. Everyone that I spoke to was either part of a company that wanted their agenda in the curriculum, so like people working in sustainability or things like that. And then there were people who had left teaching, a lot of consultants, because it was at 4 o'clock, an in-person event. And it made me think actually when you were speaking to Dee last week and about the consultant papers, how the consultation papers, sorry, and how she said, do you think that's kind of by mistake that they do 40 questions with a drop-down box? And a 4 o'clock in-person review panel meeting, what teacher is going to be able to get to that? Anyone who knows teaching knows that you can't get out and to an event by 4. So I just felt like I didn't hear myself in it. And by myself, I mean teachers.
mm.
Hello, Earthlings. This podcast is brought to you by Crown House Publishing. Crown House have published many of the most influential books of recent years, certainly many that have been the most influential on my own thinking. Things like When the Adults Change by Paul Dix, A Curriculum of Hope by Dr. Deborah Kidd, and The Wonderful Botheredness by Howell Roberts. They have also published an amazing card-based resource called Activate, a professional learning resource designed to help people develop their thinking and their practice around self-regulated learning, which is designed on my own doctoral research and which I created with my erstwhile colleagues at the Centre for Educational Leadership in the UCL Institute of Education. Anyway, as listeners to the podcast, or indeed viewers, you can receive a 20% discount on all titles from the Crown House website if you use the promo code REPOD20. That's REPOD20, all caps. That offer does exclude bundles and existing promotions, though. So head over to crownhouse.co.uk and treat yourself, or perhaps a colleague, or indeed 10 or 20. That's crownhouse.co.uk, REPOD20. Okay, let's get back to today's pod.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I guess we're still sort of waiting to see what comes out, but it did feel like we had a whole conversation about this. We had two of the reviewers on the podcast before, so we don't need to sort of to relitigate that whole thing. I think David and I equally felt that it was like, I think that evolution is famously a painfully slow process.
Yeah.
It's not even discernible from one generation to the next. And
I'd quite like to get to see the result. So evolution's not really going to work.
Right. Maybe come back in 2 million years and we'll run an extra finger. But maybe, yeah, a bit of revolution would have been nice. But equally, you can understand the need for them to be cautious, that, people are, we were talking about workload earlier, and, you need to sort of to meet people where they are and not say, right, we're going to change everything all over again and change everything all over again. Like when when Gove was in power, they changed the English curriculum halfway through the school year. And it's like, or just some of the stuff that was happening in COVID under Williamson. There have been lots of instances of just like far too much tinkering on the fly. And so you can understand the instincts to go slow, but equally, we're in a place where there's, you mentioned at one point, you very kindly quoted one of my blogs on the poly crisis, right? It's like, we're not having this conversation in a vacuum. Like, we're in a situation where there are lots of people who are very clearly struggling. Teacher retention is not in good shape. Teacher recruitment, the same. And we don't need to rehearse those things, but we are not in a great place. And so there is a bit of a sense of urgency that felt a little bit lacking in that review.
Yeah, absolutely, I'd agree.
My new quote on it is that we should compromise around the report rather than compromise within it. And that's effectively what they've done. I think the job of a report is to adopt a position, and then politicians, people with power, may wish to compromise around it. But it's not their responsibility to make that job easier.
That's so true, actually, David, isn't it? Like, could they not have? They know that that's got to go through a process where they make it realistic, right? Like, don't you put the dream on the paper and then it kind of goes through things that strip it back and make it realistic. That's really true. I hadn't thought of that before.
Yeah, compromise around the report, but don't compromise within it.
Nice. So let's move on to chapter 4, which is the children. Nice that they get
my favorite chapter,
a whole chapter to themselves. First of all, therefore, like, why did you focus the book on teacher autonomy and not like the autonomy of the children? Do you feel like, is that your follow-up? I don't know.
It's coming. I'll have to title it something different though.
Yeah.
I'll be in touch, David.
Great.
You can't have child autonomy without teacher autonomy, because if I don't if I can't make choices, I can't make the choice to give them time and space to do that. So that one had to be written first, and I quite quickly realised as I was writing the chapter that a chapter is not enough. So yeah, hopefully that one will be coming in 18 months to 2 years.
Oh, it literally is your follow-up. Is about student.
Yeah, yeah.
Amazing. Okay,
So,
but you're
but
right.
yeah,
Yeah, so it makes sense to start with teacher first.
hmm
I can see the logic there. And yeah, talk to us about this chapter. Like, and there's a couple of bits that I'd like to pull out, but yeah, you go first.
Yeah, I mean, I work in early years, so autonomy is really important, but it's also endangered right now. So I feel really strongly about protecting it. So I think that's where the kind of foundations were laid, but also the fear that's driven further up the school in that we can't allow for autonomy. I think I did it. There was a bit in the chapter where we list all the things that children definitely can't do in school, and I had to shorten that. I would have gone on for pages, but I was talking to my children about it, and they were saying, "Well, we can't do this, we can't do that," and I was listing it out. It's just becoming highly controlled, and I think it's in response to the lack of time we've got to deal with things in a more meaningful way. For example, I went to look around some secondary schools for my son, and I was speaking to the child who was showing me round, and they started telling me about, I think they called it the reflection room, which was code for detention room. And they said, well, we're not allowed to high five each other in the corridor. And I said, oh, okay, that's interesting. Tell me more. And he said, well, we're not allowed to touch each other at all, not even high five or a handshake or anything. And I said, oh, okay. And they seemed pretty upset by it. But I thought, children will tell their side. I went into the head of year and asked them about it. And they said, oh, we've had lots of complaints about consent and boundaries. And so we've just had to shut down touch. And I just thought, on what, if that was me in my early years class, which I know is different, but just I would see that as there's a gap there. They're not understanding about consent and boundaries. I need to take the time to teach them about that, to talk about that. Let's talk it through. Let's explore it. There's something going on in here that needs to come out so that we can get better at that rather than shut it down. But of course, we don't have time as we go up the school because we have more boxes to tick, more curriculum to cover, more exams to prepare for. And so instead of going into it and exploring it and learning about that and seeing it as a learning opportunity, that learning opportunity is just shut down because they don't have time to explore it. So yeah, there was lots of things coming up as I wrote that chapter.
Yeah. Can I ask, so you were talking about you being an early years teacher. I can remember this amazing experience as a secondary school trainee and going to visit, you have to go and visit. I was a secondary school teacher, you have to go and visit primary, and I went into an early years classroom. I remember the kids coming in and they self-registered, so they had like little magnets with their names on, and they sort of self-registered who was here and who wasn't here, and they had to put their name under a column as to whether they had brought a lunch or whether they needed a school lunch. So they sort of already organized that, and then they sat around and the children were sort of like leading this discussion. They were on the carpet and they were sort of saying, oh, where do you think so and so is? Has anybody heard from him? So they were sort of showing care for like the other kids who weren't there yet. And then I remember they did a little bit of chat, and I remember the teacher had a little wand and she sort of waved it over their heads, and they all like rubbed clever dust into their brains, and then they all just tottered off, and they all just went like seemingly randomly, just went off to different corners of the room. And some of them, like you were saying about art earlier, some of them were like continuing with a painting that they'd been doing the day before. Some of them were like at the water tray. Some of them were working on a story that they'd been working on, but it was really self-organized. Kind of amazed by it. And I didn't know, and I seem to remember it being quite early in the school year. So it's not like the kids had been sort of trained into this particularly. What's your sense as to I'm sure there's huge variation, but there's this sort of a bit of a truism. Is it that people sort of say that we educate it out of them, that children are able to hold a certain degree of freedom and self-rule from a really, really young age, and that they sort of they become terrified to colour outside of the lines before too long. Is that, I think, a cliche, or do you think that is that what you see in your work in early years?
Yeah, it's what I see. I think we don't trust children, and we don't trust the natural learning process anymore. We don't trust things to organically unfold because there's too much at stake. And children are very, very capable at self-government. Like my children they know the daily routine. That's the thing. They've got such safety in we have a routine. We follow the daily timetable, and it's the same every Monday, every Tuesday, every Wednesday. Like, we have certain changes. So we have music on a Friday and they know when it comes. And sometimes it doesn't happen, and they have that sense of flexibility and they can work with that. But it stops when they move to year one. That stops, and all of a sudden they're told exactly what they have to do and how they have to do it, and it doesn't quite fit developmentally. And so, I think Tina always talks about this time in the brain where it's pruning and it's getting rid of things, and then we're getting rid of really important things at a time, where all of that pruning is taking place. We're stopping the learning happening, and it seems absolutely crazy. It's like it doesn't go with that kind of neuroscience. It's not matching. And then we wonder why, when they're in year 3 and 4, that if we offer them a little bit of space to think for themselves, they can't do it, because we teach them out of that. We're not going the other way. We're not inviting them to do more of it. So yeah, definitely, I agree.
I'm picking up a message from Ken Robinson from the other side. The schools kill creativity. Yeah, podcast coming back.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that was the first thing I watched that made me realize that I absolutely loved teaching, and thought, no, this is it.
Yeah,
so true.
And there's a great page in this chapter by a guest bit, I guess, by Peter Gray, also a former podcast guest. If anyone wants to go back and listen to that one, it's a really good episode. He talks about the biology of education, and he talks about these instincts, what he calls educative instinct, and he highlights 5: curiosity, that children are born with, that he says that are these traits that are designed to help children educate themselves through self-chosen, self-directed activities. Curiosity: children are extraordinarily curious and drawn to novelty. Playfulness, of course, play is, we don't need to get into that, but there's so many dimensions to that. Play. Some people are quite dismissive of playing, like games. They usually, like, I used to play lots of games as a secondary school teacher, and people were like really down on it. They were like, "What a waste of time! Like, what's the opportunity cost? You could have been teaching them stuff." And it's like, it's really the word game does not mean that it's not serious. Like, there's so much important stuff that's packed into a game about turn taking, about being seen and heard, about reciprocating, and all of that stuff. He talks about sociability, of course, the drive to share knowledge with their peers and to include one another. Willfulness, the drive to take charge of one's own life. And I really like this last one, planfulness. It's not a word that I've come across before. The drive to plan for the future, that when they're in play, that they often plan what they're playing and how they're going to carry this out across time. And so he argued, of course, for free range education, right? For children to be in a safe, supported environment where they are able to let these instincts do what they will. And it was lovely to see that. It's a beautiful thing
when you see that.
Yeah, go on.
I just think when you go into a class that you're not expecting to see play, especially so a year 1 or a year 2 class, and you see it working, you just think, how are we not doing this? Because the level of engagement and learning is so much higher than any child I've seen sitting down doing their child admin. It's just, it's bigger than that. But I think that the thing with play is that people who don't understand it, they fear it. Again, it's that fear. It's, what does that look like? And for instance, how will Ofsted think my learning is happening? Because they might not understand it. And quite often, in my experience, Ofsted inspectors don't really understand early years. I think I had one inspection where we had a specialist come in, but I've had about 4. So I think that's, the majority not. And so you feel judged. And especially if you don't feel confident to really, question politely what they're saying, then you can feel really judged, and maybe that you're not doing a good job.
Yeah. So for the benefit of people who haven't yet read this wonderful book, in each chapter it ends with reflections, with questions for reflection and discussion, and also with recommendations. So in this one, how to get autonomy back in the classroom. avoid filling your timetable with carpet time and table work and so on. Like, but that's what it often just boils down to, is like, it's time is the currency, isn't it? How can we carve out the time and space in which for X to happen? There's also recommendations for senior leaders, for government officials, and so on. There's a chapter on digital autonomy, which I think that we need to just set aside for now, because we'll need to wrap this up shortly. Yeah, let's just close on some of these practical suggestions. If school leaders are listening to this, if teachers are listening to this, and they think, yes, I think that we've maybe tightened these screws a little bit too tight, we want to start loosening this up. Where might they start? As if they're in, you might think of this as a classroom practitioner. It could be through the eyes of a learning support assistant, perhaps. Could be senior leadership. What are some sort of practical examples that you can draw on as to, like, how can we nudge this dial towards greater autonomy?
I think the first step is to notice it, and I say that because I think we've got into a space where we're very accepting of how things are. E.g., we stopped seeing what, that the person who got told that they're moving their cards well, for a lot of teachers that's just accepted because that's how we're spoken to. So I think it's tuning in to the interactions that you're having, the things you're being asked to do first without response, just really thinking about what is it about that interaction that I don't like. Do I like it? Don't I like it? The same for senior leaders. You tune in, what are you asking of your staff, even making a note of it, because you might realize that your demands are a lot longer than you think. There's a lot more of them, and actually some of them can go. So I think tuning in and noticing is your first step. And then once you do, going in with a sense of curiosity and collaboratively about how you might move forward from that and making small change. And I personally think things like, can your staff take PPA from home when they like? Not just on a Tuesday and a Thursday, because that suits you and that gives you some sense of control. Can they take it when they like? If not, why not? Can they text in sick? Why do they have to call? There's not many private, corporate companies now that will ask them to call in sick. And I say these things because they're all the little components that send messages to your staff about how you feel about them.
Yeah.
And then once you've kind of done those smaller things, it's about thinking more on a policy level. Do the staff know the policies? Why not? Are they invested in them? Why not? Were they part of how they were drawn up? And James, obviously, this is really kind of looking at your slice teams, like bringing people in from different areas of the school community, making sure that everyone's got a voice in developing those things. And as a classroom teacher, I think you notice, you get curious, and then you get creative. So, by curious, I don't mean confrontational, going into your SLT and like it's their fault, slamming the book down on the table. Like, it's, I wonder why we do it like this, and then get creative about solutions to those things.
Nice. Thank you very much. And so the book ends on a hopeful note. There's a little outro about the future, and you say that you feel optimistic for the future. What does the future look like, do you think? What would a more autonomous system look like for you? Let's say that this book does what it says on the tin and nudges that dial. What would you like to be seeing more of in the years to come?
Like respectful interactions and more curiosity, less judgment. Yeah. That's what I would like to see for the whole school community as well. And I say that thinking about, this polarizing between parents and educators at the moment, this kind of barrier that perhaps the media is somewhat responsible for as well. Just a sense of curiosity for each other and our own individual experiences and why we're doing certain things would be lovely.
Yeah. And I wonder, actually, if just as a final thing, there was a guy, I won't be able to dig this out in real time, but there's a guy that I know who's based in Brighton. He writes a lot about digital stuff and leadership. And he wrote this piece a while ago where he had interviewed some former school leaders, or I think there were also business leaders as well, who had been quite controlling as leaders. And then they retired and they really regretted it. They really regretted what they'd done. They were like, I thought that was what strong leadership was. I thought that it was about this sort of controlling, coercive, coming down really hard on those outliers that David was talking about. And then they just talked about all this regret. And so I wonder if it might be nice to end on a final word for like, if there's somebody who's in school leadership who might possibly recognize this in their own practice, or maybe they've had desires to think, oh, I wish that I could just be a bit more controlling and just be like assert myself more. I wonder if we could just like land on a word like, what would you say somebody in that position might usefully do?
For someone who wants to be less controlling, you mean?
Yeah.
I think it's I when I wrote this book and when I did some talks for Doncaster City Council in January actually, and it was a lot of leaders in the room, and you can imagine that I did say right at the beginning that this is going to be quite uncomfortable, because what we're doing essentially is looking at what we're doing and saying that it might not be the right thing, and that's really hard because as educators we want to get it right. But I think it's really important for leaders to show self-compassion. They are under immense pressure. They are very fearful. And I think that really is the first step, that they go, right, this isn't about me personally. This is about getting caught up in a system that has been kind of reluctant to change. And we've become used to interacting, controlling. And, it's doing the inner work. I'm not saying go and sit in front of a therapist for hours. I think that would help anyone. But, doing the inner work and thinking about your intention, getting clarity with that, thinking about what is it you really want from leadership. And again, that ego side, we all have that side. We all, have this idea of how we want things, but being a little bit more considered about how you move forward with that.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, final thoughts from you, David.
Yeah, I mean, I just think this has been a really helpful conversation, which has really reflected the book. I think it's a really good vision for how we need to move forward. I'm in no doubt we need more trust. We need to give people more capacity to make decisions, particularly about their practice. I think we also need to give people more opportunities to find job satisfaction. We talk too much about delivery in teaching. If you want to do delivery, the Postal Service is still employing people. If you want to work in a classroom, your ambition should be to educate, not to deliver. And they're two different things. And I think we're now at a stage where you would really think we'd made a great job of the world, given the determination we have to make sure that it continues on the same path. When actually, what we need is we need challenge, we need bravery, we need courage, we need a vision for change and possibility. And I think the book and one of the lovely things about today, Sophie, is you've asked for very small steps at the end when you talked about where you wanted things to go. It wasn't autonomy as anarchy. It was autonomy as trust. And I think that was a really reassuring message for people, but still maintains the challenge. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Nice. So obviously everybody should go and get a copy of Sophie's amazing book. Where else can people find you, Sophie? I noticed that you've been doing some fun little videos on Instagram things recently.
Yeah, I'm having a bit of fun with it. I didn't know how my school would take it, but we'll see. Yeah, I've got two websites. So mindfulnessforlearning.com is the wellbeing centre for educators and families. And then teacherautonomy.com kind of looks into the book content more. And on Instagram and at M for Learning.
M for Learning. There you go, everybody. Thank you so much, Sophie. That's been really lovely conversation. And we'll be having another one shortly, won't we, for the Education Policy Alliance. But until then, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How it is and how it should be, racing in the streets again. One's got the other by its expectations. The other is going for a submission. Hope has stoicism by the neck. Acceptance is struggling for it on the ropes. What I want is being choked. My wheels being dragged through a hedge backwards. Not before it bloodied the nose of the world. Happy as it boxed the years of change. Contented, assaulted, progress with a change. May you find kindness under that stone. May the thaw come early this year. That bridge should be finished this year. You can go